So thank you. I grew up thinking I was going to be an artist. I did all this drawing and photography and like I was going to be a medical illustrator, all this web design, and then I decided I was going to be a pathologist. And so I think pathology for me bridges that gap between the visual and the scientific, and I think that's why I really love it. And so for me, gross photography is one of those things that is so critical because the people that are signing out the cases, right, aren't always the ones that see and touch the specimen. And so to have a record of what it looked like, what you did, I think for everyone involved in this patient care process, I think it's really, really important to have good documentation of those gross findings. And especially in the head and neck, when a lot of it is, squamous cell carcinomas, gross staging is extremely, extremely important. And so having good documentation of the gross, I think is critical. And that, of course, doesn't go for only squamous cell carcinomas, but really for any neoplastic specimen, any rare specimen, any interesting cases, I would just say photograph liberally. And, you can always delete, but you can't go back and retake once something's been cut or fixed or whatever, right? So that's my perspective. I hope that this can be an interactive lecture. I want you guys to talk with me through some of these cases. So please don't feel shy. Put things in the chat. That's also fine if you don't want to unmute yourself. So let's begin. What I would like to go through is how to take a good gross photograph and how to identify a bad gross photo and what things to do to make it better. What we will not go over, but I'm happy to take questions on privately or otherwise, is we're not really going to talk about cleaning up gross or microscopic images in something like Photoshop, but that is always available for you. I want to point out that there is this free online software called GIMP, G-I-M-P, that kind of mimics the functionality of Photoshop. It's slightly clunkier, but pretty much a lot of the things you want to do in Photoshop, you can do there if you don't have or want to pay for the Photoshop subscription. So we can always talk about that later or at another time or whatever. So what we have at UChicago is we have this MacroPath photo stand. That's basically a camera mounted on a station, hooked up to a computer with its own proprietary software. It has discrete, zoom buttons, 20%, 50%, 80%, 100%, whatever. We also have this freestanding kind of Canon camera that we use mostly if the specimens are too large to fit in that photo stand, or for things like autopsy where you want to take a picture of the whole body or the in situ kind of organ block. But we have these MacroPath stands both in the gross room and in the autopsy suite for individual organ sections. But I wanted to ask you guys, what kind of setup do you have for your photography?
We have handheld cameras. I think they're Canon as well. Mm-hmm. It's not this exact
type
model. No.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think it's just a point and shoot.
Okay. Is it mounted or you hold it freehand?
They hold it freehand. Okay. We've had some people demonstrate an interest in photo stands, but then it tends to be a little controversial. One, because of space, which is a bit of an issue for us. And then the other issue that sometimes people have is you have multiple people who might need to use it. And so you might have to wait in line, and then you have to transport the specimen over, and it might take you some time to rearrange it or whatever. I mean, I see both sides of it.
Yeah, we've traditionally always had some kind of photo station. Back in the day, it was a Canon camera that was mounted on an arm that you can sort of rotate up and down. And then we got the MacroPath stand, and to me, forcing yourself to transport the specimen and lay it out on a clean background kind of makes you think a little bit extra about how you want to position it, because you're actively taking a photograph, right? So I completely understand the ease of just having it at your station and being like, click, But that active process of transporting it and laying it on this platter kind of to me demonstrates, I don't know, a little that maybe you might think more about framing the picture. Maybe, I don't know. The other thing that's really cool about the MacroPath stand that I really like is it's connected to our network drive. So when you snap the picture, it immediately goes to our network drive that anybody can see, as opposed to the Canon, right, where you have to take out the card, put it in, download the files, transfer them to the network drive. So what's cool about the MacroPath stand is if our residents have a grossing question, they take a picture and we can just look at it immediately from our desks, because our gross room is about a 10-minute walk from our offices. And so it's not always easy for us to just drop everything and walk over there. But we do a lot of interactive discussion using the pictures that they've taken, or sometimes if it's a live case, we just use like FaceTime or something to talk about a case. But for our actual like publication quality photographs, we'll use the MacroPath stand. So those are the benefits I see about it. We have overhead, in our lab, we have fluorescent lights, but we also have these tungsten bulbs that are kind of angled on either side downward at the specimen that are, so we'll talk a little bit about lighting later, but those are the setups we have. We have the overhead fluorescent lights and the tungsten bulbs. So what I'm going to do is I'll show you a number of gross photographies. I guess in this case, some of my residents and PAs took these photos, and you'll tell me what do you think is wrong with the photo. We'll also look at good examples for comparison so we know how to make modifications. And this is my recommendation. Your group may choose to do things differently. That's cool. That's awesome. There's no one right way to do things. But if you do things differently, speak up. Let's talk about it. Let's come up with a common way that we might like to share ideas about gross photography. So first example, what's wrong with this photograph? Specimen isn't entirely in the picture. Exactly. Like there's a huge dead white space on the right, and then the cross section is cut off on the left. So, I mean, that's obviously an easy fix. To me, this indicates maybe like a tad amount of laziness on the person's part to just like whoop, shift it over. So yes, certainly tissue is off center. So we want to be able to center the image. We want all of the tissue kind of in the section. This may or may not be a true or an artifactual hole right in the cross section. Sometimes there's just cystic degeneration of tissue. Sometimes it's a bad section. If it is a bad section, maybe choose something different. If it is a region of cystic degeneration, then that's cool. Like that's real. That should be photographed. But if it's not, even if it's an artifact, maybe try to avoid that. So here's examples of how that specimen could be fixed. Oh, the other thing I should point out about the MacroPath stand is that it has the ability in the software to annotate. So if you want to like circle a region of interest or put an arrow, you can do that, and then it'll save a copy of that image with the annotations, and it'll have a copy saved without the annotations. So that's really cool for demonstrating, specimen orientation and inking and labeling and things like that. So here, right, left, somebody put that in, so I now know exactly, what side of the thyroid gland this is, for example. Okay, next picture, what's wrong here? Some of them are subtle and some of them are obvious, but what might be wrong here? Or where's room for improvement? I won't say wrong, it's not completely wrong.
Is the ruler out of plane?
The ruler's a little bit of a weird angle, but could use gauze to dab away blood. Yeah, blood. So my beef with this picture was that there's like bloody gauze in the background, like a bloody chuck. And so I kind of had this picture of like blood spattered on cotton when I saw this. So in our lab, I try to ask the photographers to avoid those chucks because they create some extra dirt in the background that isn't really necessary. We have essentially a cutting board where we put the photograph on, where we put the specimen on and photograph it on the cutting board that is wiped clean. So I would say avoid those chucks, avoid the gauze, avoid like paper towels in the background, because that causes some background noise that isn't really I don't know, useful. So this is kind of a similar problem with blood in the background, but in this case, the blood is also where? The blood is on the ruler, exactly. And so you might say, okay, that like, so what, the blood is on the ruler, you can still see the markings. You can, and that's fine. That's fine if you're not going to ever publish this or anything. But sometimes you don't know that this isn't like the most rare tumor in the world, and you're going to want to publish it or put it in a poster, or somebody's going to want to do something with it. So, you know, I would argue try to keep both the background and the label as clean as possible. And you're gonna say, well, can't I just Photoshop the blood out? Like, absolutely. You can always do image manipulation. So you're gonna say, ha, I can do whatever I want. Yes, of course you can do whatever you want. If you're not great at Photoshop, or if you don't know how to modify these images, try to keep them as clean as possible. Cleaning up the ruler, I would argue, is really, really much more challenging than cleaning up the background, because the background is sort of this space that you can crop out. The ruler has these tines that you can't really modify. So my advice, however, is if you do have a bloody ruler, is we have actually just taken a photograph of a clean ruler that we can then slap on to any image we want. So I've cleaned up, in this example, I've cleaned up the background, right? So that the blood from the background is gone and it's now just gray. And I've just taken that clean image of a ruler and sized it appropriately and just laid it over so that the bloody ruler is gone. So this was a great idea from one of our other pathologists who was like, can I just take me a picture of a ruler and I can put it in anywhere? And I was like, oh, that great idea. That solves all of our ruler cleaning problems. So that's what we've done. So we just have a JPEG of a ruler. Do you have, this is with shadows? Yeah, so we're actually gonna, I have some examples later of shadows, and I feel like the shadows are less of an issue with the camera. Like, it's not really the macro path versus the Canon, it's the lighting that you have. And so I'll show you what the shadows look like with the tungsten lights versus the light stand. But honestly, shadows have been an issue that we have had problems with, because we are on a flat surface. So no matter where your light is coming from, you're going to have shadows. What we have done, actually, I'm gonna, let me do a, you know what, I'm going to talk more about this when I show those examples, but I've seen some institutions have setups where they have gotten rid of the shadows, and I'll demonstrate what they've done, but I'll approach that later. Good question. Okay. So sometimes what I've seen also with bloody or dirty specimens is there's like sometimes like just conglomerated, coagulated chunks of blood on the specimen. And if you don't wipe them off or rinse them off before you take the photograph, you just get globs of blood that obscure. And I've tried to encourage people not to be afraid to rinse these. I don't know if there's a fear of putting them underwater is gonna, like, you know, leach the tissue. But if you're very, very briefly just rinsing the external surface of a specimen, you won't ruin it. I argue you will clean up whatever excess surgical blood, goo, whatever is there, and you'll actually have a nice, clean external surface of the specimen for you to photograph. What then happens, though, is that sometimes you kind of get this drippy, like watery blood in the background. And so that requires a little bit of extra cleaning or patting off. But I will say, if it's a bloody surgery and there's a lot of blood, just wipe it off or rinse it off so you could actually see what's underneath it. You don't want to obscure the tissue. Okay. The next, this is the only image. What's wrong? So it's a little dark, I would argue. But first of all, what type of, do you know what type of specimen it is? And secondly, what's the problem? I think it's a thyroid. I think there's a suture on one of the lobes. And you're looking through your files and you're like, oh, cool, they took photographs of the specimen. And then this is all you see. What's missing?
Photos of the cut surface.
Photos of the cut surface. Thank you. So, I mean, I think there is orientation. There's a suture on one end. So you could say this is the suture at the superior pole or the inferior pole or whatever. So actually this is good for orientation because it shows you the lay of the land of the specimen. But as mentioned, there is no cut section of tumor, right? And so if you're going to take an image of the external surface, please also take an image of the cut surface because it gives you different information, right? The outer surface gives you orientation. The cut sections give you what's going on inside. Where's the tumor? How big is it? What does it look like? What is the texture of it? How does it approach the margin, right? So always, I would say, you know, if you can do both, do both. If you can only do one, you know, give us cut sections of the tumor, because sometimes the orientation is obvious in some cases and sometimes it's not. But you know, the more, again, the more the merrier. Always demonstrate the cut surface. Show me the tumor. Okay, this is the only image. What's wrong? Like what's going on, right? You're so zoomed in. You're like, where are we? What specimen is it? What does the border look like? I don't know. So I try to tell people, you know, don't lose the forest for the trees. Like you may have one area of interest. You're like, oh, that's a really cool scar. Like I want to take a picture of that. That's awesome. But then zoom out and take the whole thing, right? So we want it all. So it's okay to take in a close up on a region of interest. Also zoom out and take that whole cross section. And then we have some orientation. Now I'm giving you the opposite problem, right? What's wrong with this specimen? I don't know if the camera doesn't have a zoom or you were unable to get close to it because the specimen was like really stinky or something. I don't know, but you know, zoom in, physically zoom in or zoom in electronically with your camera. So this is the opposite, right? Don't lose the trees for the forest. We don't really need all that white space, or in this case, black space in the background. So please zoom in as far as possible so that the object fills the frame. Our MacroPath stand, as I said before, has these sort of preset zooms. So I'm limited by these steps. I can't do any fine tuning. So usually what I do on the MacroPath is I zoom in as far as I possibly can. If the specimen gets cut off, then I step back and then I know that I'm as much as I can do. Whereas you guys, if you have a handheld camera, you can go in as far as you want. You can go out as far as you want. I would say when I used to use our Canon, our handheld Canon, I would sometimes even use I guess it's like the macro setting, like the little flower button where you could, I think that was indicating a really, really tiny or a really close up object. So I don't know if you have that setting on your camera, but sometimes I would use that for small objects or when I was trying to zoom in really, really close, because I think that macro setting was good for these kind of small zoomed in objects. Our MacroPath stand does this kind of auto-focusing thing. It usually does okay, zoomed really, really well far in. The only problem we have is that if it's a three-dimensional specimen and there's some height to it, it only focuses in one plane. So you can kind of click on the plane of interest and tell it where to focus, but it's not like a camera that you guys have, or like a single lens reflex camera where you may be able to change the aperture settings to increase the field of focus. Like advanced cameras allow you to do that, right? Where you can actually have multiple planes in focus, but most of our cameras in the gross room don't. So you really just want to be careful of what plane you're focusing on if it's a three-dimensional specimen. Okay, so in this case, as opposed to the case on the left, for the case on the right, we've zoomed in as far as we possibly can. These are really small pieces of tissue, and in fact, we fit multiple sections in the same frame, which is fine in this example. They're nice and clean, they're laid out appropriately, fine. We have a crop function in CoPath that automatically expands the cropped image once you save it. Yeah, so so why can't I just crop it later? Thank you for that introduction. So two issues I found. One is the auto exposure of our camera. So in my experience, the camera both focuses better and adjusts the exposure settings better if more of the tissue fills the frame. Because when the camera is zoomed so far out, it actually adjusts in our system where it's not manual, it's automatic. It exposes it adjusts the exposure settings to the background and less so on the specimen. So the specimen often becomes really, really dark. Our current background is a paler color. So it's adjusting the exposure to the pale color, and then the specimen is too dark. The other thing is when I zoom in, it fixes the exposure and that the specimen becomes much brighter. If you have exposure settings that you can change, then that's probably not an issue. But if you're doing automatic stuff, it becomes an issue. Secondly is image resolution. So as you know, these cameras are limited by pixel space, right? By pixel dimensions. And so the resolution is not infinite, right? You're composed of these little dots. And so if you want to publish or use this photograph for presentation, you waste precious pixel space on irrelevant background. So yeah, you can crop it, but then when you want to print it at 300 DPI at 5 inches, your information is gone and the image becomes blurry, right? So why waste all that precious pixel space on background? So that's why I say crop it now, don't crop it later. So yeah, sure, you could crop it, but try it out. Take some images really zoomed out and really zoomed in on the same specimen and crop it and magnify it and see if you lose information. That would be my recommendation. So those are my suggestions as to why I don't crop it later. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. The other suggestion I tell people is, they say, oh, but I want to get the whole ruler in, so I'm zoomed really, really far out. Well, is there a point? Is there really a need to photograph the entire ruler when is the ruler the object of interest or is the specimen? And so I say, all you need is a few little marks on the ruler for size. You don't need the whole ruler. So zoom into the specimen. We can measure things later if all you have is a centimeter. It doesn't matter. You don't need the whole ruler. So that's my recommendation. Keep zooming in. That's really all you need. Okay. This is one of my favorites. What's wrong here? What color do you see?
Not white balanced.
Okay, not white balanced. What's the color tone that's off? Where is it shifted towards? Towards warm or towards cool?
Warm.
Warm, yeah, it's kind of yellow, right? Okay. So I think probably the worst part about this photo is that color balance. So I don't know. I just had this image of like, wow, it looks so yellow. It's like, did you pee on the table? So yes, it's the white balance, it's the light settings. So I have had days where somehow the white balance and setting got adjusted and every single photograph taken that day was just yellow and it was disgusting. So if you end up seeing tonal issues, we can fix it, right? We can fix the white balance, we can fix the exposure, we can fix the lighting settings. So here's the lighting. So now we're going to talk about light quality and we're going to talk about shadows, etc. So in a nutshell, like if you zoom back to photography class, okay, daylight is perfect. Daylight is the ideal light setting. It's not too warm, it's not too cool. It has all of the visual spectra. It is what photographers crave, right? So I don't know what it's like today in Cleveland, but today in Chicago, it's overcast. And so it's not too bright, it's not too dark, and everything is illuminated, right? Nothing is too bright because you don't have bright sun shining on anything. And you don't have these really harsh shadows either, right? Because you don't have this direct light that's casting a shadow. You have just this diffuse global illumination, right? So that is beautiful for photography, okay? But we don't have that in our gross rooms, right? We don't have overcast, beautiful daylight. We have bulbs. So overhead fluorescent bulbs tend to cast a bluish tone. And the regular sort of tungsten light bulbs, which are the ones we have in our light stand, tend to imbue a warm or a yellowish cast, right? So you have this cool and this yellow dichotomy. So the prior picture was probably taken with the light stand on with those tungsten bulbs, right? With an incorrect white balance, okay? And so these are the white balance settings on our Canon camera. Kelvin, tungsten, fluorescent, daylight, flash, cloudy, shade, whatever. Usually, depending on what your light is, you can test out the tungsten, you can test out the fluorescent, you can test out the daylight and see where it gets you, right? So probably the prior photograph may have been taken not on the tungsten setting, right? It was taken on the fluorescent or on the daylight setting, and it just ended up looking too yellow. Okay. So play around with it and find the setting that is appropriate for your working area. So this is a similar but different problem. It's really dark. I don't know, to me, this is really dark. I don't know if an eclipse happened on the lighting or what, but I would say don't just let this go, right? You can evaluate your photographs as you take them and try again. Check the light stand settings, check the camera settings. What I recommend our residents do is take one photo with our tungsten light stand on and one photo with the tungsten light stand off, so that it's mostly the fluorescent bulbs. And in different cases, one is better than the other, and I'll show you examples of why. So in this example on the left and on the right, which is more warm and which is more cool? Therefore, which is fluorescent and which do you think is the tungsten? So the left is warm or cool?
Cool. It's
Cool. All right. So that means it's
Tungsten. No, fluorescent.
fluorescent. Yes.
Sorry.
The left is cool, fluorescent. Right is warm, tungsten. Okay, so it's subtle, right? But you can see the differences. And so maybe one specimen looks better with a little bit of a cool tone, and maybe one specimen looks better with a little bit of a warm tone. And I've literally chosen pictures differently based on these two settings for what I think is more appropriate for that specimen. The other thing that you'll notice, you guys were talking earlier about the shadows. So in our lab, right, the fluorescent are just these big wads overhead, right? And the tungstens are closer down and at an angle. So you can see how the shadows on the right, on the light stand tungsten, are longer, right? Because the light is closer and at more of an angle. The shadows on the left, on the fluorescent, are really tight because the light is just coming directly from overhead. So you can guesstimate the angle of the light based on these shadows that are cast. So I tend to have, here are my suggestions. One, you can clean up the background and essentially make both the background cutting board and the shadows kind of go away by just putting a colored paint over the background, so that then your specimen is not on a shadow at all. And I think that's how where is it? The example, like, yeah, this one, right? This one, I just wiped everything. I wiped the shadow, I wiped the blood, I wiped everything. So it's kind of floating in space without a shadow. Some people don't like this look because it makes a specimen look a little floaty, like it's not grounded. So some people like the shadow to show the grounding. So you could adjust the location of your lights and the placement of your lights in relationship to the specimen. So right, the farther away, the more diffuse, the closer in, the more intense the shadow. So these are intense and long shadows. Now, let me do a whiteboard, because I want to show you. Can you see the whiteboard?
Yes.
Okay. So when I was a fellow at MGH, what they had was they had a camera on a stand, on an arm. They had a piece of glass, and then suspended on a table, and they had a table underneath it. And on the table, there was a sheet of black velvet. All right, so the background was black as night. And then they would put the specimen on, on the glass. Okay, so the way that the lighting was set up was that because you had this really dark velvet background and the specimen was elevated from the background on glass, the velvet background would actually take over whatever small like defects were on the glass. And so there were like no shadows and no background. It was awesome. Like it was a really, really great setup. And it was in a small room by itself with appropriate, a light stand, lights, coming from either direction in a dark room. So it was great. And the photos that came up with this setup, I thought were brilliant because they required minimal modification of the background. They didn't have blood, they didn't have shadows, but it was a huge deal, right? You'd have to take the specimen into this private room, set up your lights, set up whatever. So it was great. But if you want to completely eliminate a lot of the background artifact, this setup was the best that I've seen, in all honesty. So I haven't been able to accomplish this because, as you know, it does require a lot of effort, but it was super cool. All right. So, oh, now I stopped sharing again. Share. There we go. Okay. So that's my recommendation for shadows and backgrounds and lighting. Okay. Next specimen, what's wrong? Or do you guys have questions? No. Okay, what's wrong with this guy? To me, it looks like a salivary gland. I think there's some like kind of lobulated salivary tissue on the kind of bottom and left. There's a whitish lesion on the top right. Ink, thank you. It's like chimney sweep. Okay, so I saw this, I was like, oh, you're zoomed in, you have a nice cut section, but it's all like smushed in black ink. So I realize that ink bleeds. It sucks. And so, we all try to use vinegar, right, to blot off the specimen so that the ink doesn't run as much. I'm a little bit obsessive with the amount that I vinegar my specimens. So when I ink the outer surface, I will then kind of take gauze and like dab the ink and then vinegar the gauze and then dab it in and then remove it and then do that again. I'll dab the gauze and squeeze the vinegar, remove it. Dab the gauze, squeeze the vinegar, remove it until pretty much hardly any ink comes off onto the gauze. So that when I remove the gauze after having vinegared it, it's like almost clean. And that's when I know I've fully vinegared the specimen. I realize that takes a lot of time and you may not have time or effort or energy to do that, but at least do a couple rounds of gauze and vinegar. And I think you'll be a little bit better with the ink bleeding, but ink will bleed. It's just the nature of the beast. So if there is ink that gets on the cut surface, again, I'll say, rinse it off, wipe it off, take a paper towel and wipe it with water. It's fine. You're not gonna ruin the specimen again by wiping that surface with water or even with formalin if you want to use something to wipe that black off. So change out your inky gloves, rinse, vinegar, whatever. We don't want it to look chimney sweepy. Okay. What would I say is imperfect here? Maybe not completely wrong, but I would say imperfect. You got nice lighting, you got a cut section of the tumor, blood, no ruler.
It's butterflied.
It's butterflied. So all of these things are correct. It's a little bloody. There is no ruler, but that's my beef. My beef is the bivalve or the butterfly. So
Oh my God, I just want to take some scissors and like finish the cut. It's so close.
it's so close. Just thank you for saying that. Boom. You're just like, ah, exactly. So, does keeping this mirror image partially intact actually add anything to our understanding of the specimen? I would say no. Just cut through it. Completely section through that half whether it be bisected, not bivalved, right? Or serially sectioned, cut through it. So I like to, it's like you've got your little, your oyster on your half shell or whatever, right? Like just pull that top half off. So I don't like the bivalves or the mirror images or the ink blots, because I don't really think that there is a reason to retain this intact. You lose information here in the crevice. You can actually see that there's an adrenal gland here right on top of this mass, and you haven't fully sectioned through the adrenal gland. So what else is in there? I don't know. It's hiding, right? Cut through it. It's fine. It's fine. Similar process with this soft tissue tumor. I'm saying this is not a mastectomy. What's wrong? Again, those sections are not completely cut through. This is essentially keeping this intact is completely useless if the specimen, a lot of these soft tissue sarcomas in our institution are not oriented, right? So what is keeping one end intact really going to do when the specimen has no orientation to begin with? You don't allow it to fix as well if you keep, a couple centimeters intact. So don't bookend it. Interesting things are hiding in the crevices. Bread loaf, like all the way through. If you make multiple complete sections through that specimen, or even bisect it down the middle and you have two halves or you have multiple sections, you can still maintain orientation if needed be, right? By placing gauze in between those slices, lining them back up again, and then wrapping it like a little Humpty Dumpty baby, right? Okay, so you can put Humpty Dumpty back together again if you cut it and lay it out appropriately. Because you can see the mirror image, right? And you can see which faces meet each other, right? So you can always lay them back together if you need to. I would argue if you ever do this, just put gauze or put paper towels in between those slices so that you can wick the formalin through, right? Because if you lop them back together, you're just going to have the same problem of tissue on tissue and you're not going to fix appropriately. So if you cut anything, always put gauze in between to help the tissue preserve. The exceptions to this rule, at least in our institution, and when please tell me if there are other exceptions at your guys' institution, but mastectomies, they need the orientation. I get it. There are quadrants, there are nipples, I get it. So they keep the anterior side completely intact. So it is a book and we can walk through it. The other exception are the bisected halves of uteri. So our GYN pathologists say you can bisect the uterus at the fundus. Like you don't have to keep, the fundus hanging on. You can totally separate, anterior from posterior sides. But when you're cutting, what they like, the residents, when they're cutting through the endomyometrium transversely, to keep most of those sections intact at the serosal surface and only take one representative or two, representative full cross sections all the way through to the serosa. So they kind of have like a fundus region, then your full section that's removed, and then your kind of lower uterine cervical region. So they like to keep that orientation intact in case they need to go back as well. So those are the only two suggestions I've had from our pathologists as to when to keep the specimens intact. GYN here is the same. Okay, cool. Are there any other specimens or services that ask for specimens to be kept intact for various reasons? Or are those mainly the exceptions? Sounds like it's pretty similar. Okay, good. That's good to know. That's good to know. I don't want to be giving advice that is not uniformly held. So cool. The other, recommendation I'll have is to always try to photograph the specimen fresh if possible, because it shows the truest colors of that tissue. Partially fixed tissues, as you know, tend to have these central kind of bloody red areas, which, is fine. We deal with, it's a known complication of fixation. If you take your photographs fresh, this is less of an issue. But for this specimen, my favorite organ, thyroid, for thyroids, for prostates, where we essentially have to fix them overnight in order to preserve the integrity of that peripheral tissue plane, because there's a lot of slippage. So we fix those overnight before cutting them to preserve the integrity of the outer plane. But then you risk that fixation edge, right? Where the outer part is fixed and brown, and then the inner part is a little bit more fresh and bloody. But this is what we sacrifice for nice intact tissue planes. It is what it is. Okay. The other improvement I could make on these sets of photographs. The person here was extraordinarily thorough, and that's cool. They photographed every single slice of the tumor, so you could visually walk through it from top to bottom. Like, as a pathologist on the receiving end of this case, where I haven't seen the gross, this is really cool because, I get to see it as they saw it. However, I would also argue that you're kind of doing the same thing where you're really, really, really far zoomed out. So I would say, if you do this, that's fine, but don't just stop here. Go one extra step and then photograph a pertinent, nice representative section, only zoomed in on that one nice cross section, because you have the same issue of the zooming out and zooming in. So that lay of the land is fine if you choose to do it, but then isolate one and take a nice close up of one. Okay. This was also one of my favorites. I think if my residents and PAs and stuff, when you can take a gross photograph and make me laugh, even if it's a bad photograph, you've done something entertaining. So what's going on here? So I'll see if I can orient ourselves. So it looks like there's some reddish brown skeletal muscle on the outside. I think yep, so here's your skeletal muscle. This looks like a portion of a bone. I think it was a rib. I think this is tumor. But then, like, what happened over here? What happened? So I asked the resident, I was like, what did you do? Like, I don't understand what happened. So I think it looked like, did they take a bite out of it? Did they like say, oh, this is a rib? And yeah, huh? And like, oh shoot, this isn't food. I have to actually cut it and like gross it. I don't know what happened. So I think what happened was they saw that there was like tumor bulging on one aspect of the specimen. I think they probably cut into it and then like chunked some of it out and then like got tumor, and then we're told, oh, you have to fully section it. Oh, okay. So then they have a part of the tumor ice cream scooped out, and then they went to the bandsaw and cut through the bone. My guess is that's what happened. So they tried to rectify their initial grossing mistake by eventually cutting all the way through, but we could have done better, right? We could have cut all the way through to begin with, had a complete cross section of the tumor and the interface to rib and skeletal muscle, etc. So hopefully they learned from their mistake. I got a kick out of this because it just made me laugh. So, section and take your full thickness photographs before carving out tissue for submission. Don't take a bite out of the specimen. Okay. Hopefully you found that as entertaining as I did. All right, so do you guys have comments or questions? Otherwise, I have some additional kind of good examples for things that I aspire to.
I just had one thing kind of related to your thing that you said about the gauze between the slices. So
Yeah.
One thing that I used to do as a resident, I would just lay out a bunch of paper towels,
Mm-hmm.
and I would lay out my slices on the paper towel, and I would write on there, like the orientation, like at the top I'd write S, and at the bottom I'd write I, and like arrow to indicate what order we're going in. And even if you have to go in multiple like directions, you can snake your way through it.
Yes.
And then literally just roll it up.
Mhm.
And that way you have a layer of paper towel between every slice.
Mhm.
And when you are done fixing it, or even if you just have to go back to the specimen, you just literally unroll it and it's
Mhm.
right there, like as you had left it before.
Mhm.
Just a suggestion.
So let me ask you this one finesse question. When you rolled it, were your slices then like distorted?
Well, I would roll
Like
it so
wavy?
that, no, usually not, because you have to be a little careful. Like you don't roll it like a
You
sausage.
folded it.
Yeah, you fold it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Cool.
that every slice is still flat. Yeah.
Yes.
And then
So
you need a container that can fit it, obviously.
yes. Okay, great. So I've had residents do that same concept. It's cool. Like or you can do like slice 1, slice 2, slice 3, slice 4, slice 5. Exactly. But then they literally roll it and then like put a rubber band around it. And so all of the slices are like,
Yes.
flop-tastic, and you can't, they fix distortedly. And
Right.
you can't like push them down into the cassette. So
Right.
I would say definitely if you do it that way, like you said, fold it flat rather than rolling it.
Yes, agree.
Awesome, great. That's also a great suggestion. Yeah. So I've seen successful and unsuccessful ways of rolling / folding, and I think I'm totally fine with folding. Yeah, awesome. And I do think when you are when it is an oriented specimen, like you're saying, that is a great way to maintain that orientation. An unoriented specimen, you would still do the same thing, but without necessarily like laying out your arrows and stuff. Exactly. Cool. What else? Anybody else? All right. So in the last few minutes, I'll just go over my finesse points. So here, room for improvement is quite subtle. I would say if you think about the orientation of a landscape versus portrait, right? Landscape is horizontal orientation. Portrait is like a vertically oriented field. So I think that people are so used to the camera being oriented, at least ours, because we don't have a free floating one, right? Ours is oriented horizontally. So they think sometimes that the specimen also has to be oriented so that you are looking at it in the correct anatomic orientation. But that's not always the best way to photograph the specimen, because if it's in this case, if it's longer vertically than it is horizontally, I would say just rotate it so that the specimen is laying down horizontally, even if the anatomic orientation is not that way, because then you could actually zoom farther in, right? Because you've oriented it in the direction of the camera. You could position it properly and zoom farther in so that you lose that white space, right? Because if you're orienting it this way, you can't really zoom farther in without cutting it out. If you rotate it, you probably can zoom farther in and only cut out white space. So that's why I would say we can rotate the photos later, that's fine, but make sure you zoom in as far as possible and orient the specimen in the direction, right? So if it's a long specimen, orient it long ways. We see larynxes or things that you have to prop, right? So I'd say always try to open it up or prop it, or somehow use your forceps or your sticks or your clay modeling, modeling clay to prop this up in a way such that the actual lesion of interest is exposed. So on the left, it's okay, but it's kind of in the shadows and in the crevice. So we've propped it up and it's a little bit better. The thing we like here of this bladder is we have kind of an overview, right, of the opened up bladder where you see the granularity of the mucosal wall fresh before it's sectioned. And then we have, after it's been fixed and cut, then we have full cross sections of the wall of the bladder with the lesion in it. So again, we have a nice overview and we have nice cut sections. Same with the uterus, we have our overview and then we have our cut sections. And this, again, these two types of photographs give you different information. And if you are a human being that is not seeing the gross specimen yourself, these kinds of photographs I think are really, really helpful. So again, take as many fresh photos as you can. You can see the photograph on the left is fresh, the photographs on the right are post-fixation. And it gives you a little bit of a different color and tutorial information. Okay, this one is good. It's oriented appropriately. It fills the field of view. There's no room to zoom in anymore. In this case, we have both sides of the fresh specimen. We have the kind of more fatty side, and we have this fascial or this serosal side, so that gives you some kind of orientation. And then we have a nice full thickness cross section of the lesion, with ink only on the outer edge and not really obscuring the tumor. So that was great. In this case, again, of a tubular gut specimen, we have the gut opened up where you can see the tumor in the lumen. We have a little bit of a closer up view of the tumor, bird's eye instead of the bird's eye. And then boom, we have a nice cross section of the lesion where you can see how it's puckering up the mucosa and the muscularis, etc. So this was sort of a nice landscape of that tumor. We do ask our residents and our PAs to put their initials on the photograph so we know who took it. So if we need to go back and ask questions, we can. I don't know what your protocol is, but some people remember, some people don't. I like to, compliment people if they've taken good photographs for, positive feedback, not just room for improvement. So one thing that I did was I did this quote unquote pass the poop challenge. I have this totally impulse buy like squishy poop emoji pillow in my office. And when people would submit their gross photographs to me, and every couple of weeks I would pick a winner, and they would get to keep the poop pillow at their desk as like a reward for the good gross photograph. And then at the end of the year, I gave everybody little like poop toy like keychains or whatever. So it was just a fun thing to get people to take good photos, and show others cool specimens, and have a discussion around photography. So whether it helped or not, in the long run, I'm not sure, but I think it was a fun thing to do. And so yeah, that was my poop challenge. So if you guys have any other questions or comments, or examples of photography you want to share with me.
I guess my question is, I did forget that we used to use the clay, right? So instead of holding things up by forceps or holding it with our hands and taking a photo with the other hand, you just have clay at the station. It's just regular modeling clay from Art Store.
Yeah, it's modeling clay from the art store because it doesn't dry out. So it's like continually malleable. So yeah, we can like stick it to the surface and then prop up the thing on it. It doesn't really work if you have like something that's trying to fold inward, and you have to like retract. You might still need to use a forceps for that kind of thing. But if it's just a matter of like tilting, that works really well. Yeah. Do you have specific requirements for photographs that should be taken for each organ specimen type that residents PAs are asked to follow? Thank you for, thank you guys. Thank you all. So no, because my suggestion is more rather than less. So the only requirements we have for photography are medical legal cases. Like you cannot not take a photograph of any medical legal case or anything that is to be returned to the patient, like hardware, right? Or whatever. So though there are a few surgical hardware specimens that we require to take photographs of, the actual tissue specimens, there are no, hard and fast requirements, but generally people know if it's me, take a photograph, or you might hear about it. So mandibles, larynxes, thyroids, because I look at it with the resident when they come to sign out and they bring their computer, or I'm at my computer, we can open up our network drive and look at the photographs together. And on more, most occasions, I'll say, let's look at the photograph together. I didn't see this, you saw it, or neither of us saw it. Did you look at the gross? Let's look at the gross together. The other reason I ask people to sort of for me, it's at least all tumor cases, right? It's at least all tumor cases, for a number of reasons, not only to help me out during sign out, but also to help the clinical teams. So on multiple occasions, we've had questions with orientation or issues with positive margins on these head and neck specimens. And I go back to the surgeon and I show them a photograph of the overview. I show them a photograph of the cut sections, and I say, this is the area where your margin was positive. Here's what it looks like on the cut section. Here's where the ink is touching the tumor. It's here. And they can just look at it and say, oh, okay. Rather than me having to describe and be like, well, it's about 2 inches in from the top left and around the corner on the deep margin, like that just doesn't work, right? They're visual people like us. And if you can show them a photograph and say, there's your margin, that helps. So, I
Yeah,
would
that
say
makes
that.
sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think I just was asking because, our residents are very busy in the gross room, and so I certainly understand the challenges that come from that and dealing with the handheld cameras and, the lighting and everything. But there are certain instances where that key photo is missing.
Right.
And yeah, that's really what prompted the question, if there's more guidance that you provide your residents. But I certainly understand, just being very proactive at the time of sign out and reviewing the gross and making it clear that it is important. I think it instills that message in them. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, no, thank you for asking. And I think that, sometimes the more rules we put on for what needs to be done, then I think the less it gets done when it isn't stated, right? So if I say you have to take a photograph of every X, then they
Right,
won't photograph every Y, right?
right, absolutely.
Cool.